everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to another Demystifying Post-Production Motion Monday. My name's Ellie, I'm a trainer at Maxon, and I'm joined by some very special people today. So we have Ian Robinson, we have Dustin Valkmar, who unfortunately we can't see, but he is with us. And we also have Adrian and Saul in the background to help with all of our Redshift questions. So how's it going, guys? Good to see you.
It's amazing.
Good.
Hello, everyone.
Yes. Hello,
He
hello.
is here, I promise.
The ominous voice in the background is here.
Yes. It's good to see you all. So before I hand over to you, Ian, and we can talk about some lovely Redshift stuff, I just thought I'd talk about the other live shows we have going on this week and month at Maxon. As you can see, we've got Mondays Redshift workflows in different DCCs. So today is going to be ZBrush, and then next week we have Houdini, and the final week is going to be inside of Maya. And then we've also started a new-ish hands-on with Maxon workshop, which is a whole character creation workflow. So on Wednesday is going to actually be episode 3, where we're going to be diving into UV unwrapping and texturing in Redshift. So I'm super excited for that. And then if you just sort of scroll down, you can see all the other great shows we have going on. We've got Ask the Trainer, Maxon Color. Those are alternate Thursdays on the Maxon Training Team YouTube channel. And then we also have VFX and Chill with Seth and Hashi. If you ever miss any of our sessions, then don't worry, because everything gets recorded, or pretty much everything gets recorded and timestamped and gets uploaded onto this little training team channel here. So we have playlists for everything. We've got Redshift quick tips, Cinema 4D quick tips. So if you want to learn something new, definitely head over to there. And you can also see the upcoming live streams that we have for Ask the Trainer and Maxon Color. And I also wanted to talk about ZBrush Live, or maybe Ian, you could talk a little bit about ZBrush Live if we're talking about live events that are going on throughout this month.
Yeah, absolutely. So ZBrush Live is a platform that has a ton of ZBrush artists, and they go live pretty much every single day. We have a channel, a YouTube and a Twitch channel that we run through, and the goal behind it is that these ZBrush artists, all of them are professionals in their own right. They all come from various walks of life. So you'll have character artists, you'll have statue creators, you'll have game developers, you'll have art directors, you'll have hard surface sculptors, you'll have just a plethora of individuals that have all sorts of different knowledge of their skill set and the background. And so ZBrush Live is dedicating to them using the software and showcasing how they use it on a day-to-day basis. And you get to come in and ask questions and hang out with them and kind of pick their brain a little bit while they work. So for some of us like myself, I go live every Wednesday, typically from 10 a.m. to noon Pacific Standard Time. And I love to run projects and answer questions. So it's very dedicated to getting answers or questions answered, and then to showcasing an overall project based workflow. So you'll see a lot of start to finish. So sometimes you'll see multiple streams of mine where we're going through the project and it takes like 5-6 weeks to get it done, because I don't usually do much more to those projects unless it's actually on the stream. So ZBrush Live, it's a really great place, a really great resource to learn ZBrush and get your questions answered in a live format.
Cool, thanks, Ian.
You're welcome.
Also, speaking of learning new things and kind of developing your software skills, we have revamped Cineversity. And so if you haven't been on it recently, this is what the new Cineversity looks like. And as you can see, we've got a whole bunch of new Getting Started series across the whole of the Maxon tools. So Cinema 4D, Redshift, Universe, ZBrush, and we can scroll over. And we also have Forger, Magic Bullet, and Trapcode. So definitely, if you haven't checked that out yet, I'd recommend you having a little look and diving into something new. Also, really quickly, before I hand it over to Ian, before we talk about what happened last Wednesday with the announcement, there is a handout section inside of GoToWebinar where we like to say thank you for you guys being part of our sessions, and you can actually get a free t-shirt. All you have to do is click that link, type in the password, which is Creative 2023, and then it's good for one shirt. All you have to do is pay for shipping, which will vary depending on where you're from. And then we also have these links that we've just looked at, including project files. So if you have a project file for today, maybe we could ping it over and I can upload that later this week for everyone.
Sounds awesome.
Cool. Also, before one final thing I haven't done. Normally I say hey to everyone in the questions area, which I haven't done. It's Monday, so please forgive me. I'm still on weekend brain apparently. So hey to Josh, to Jim, Marcelo, Charles, Arturo, Jay, Jim. It's great to see you guys. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
So I guess, Ian, maybe I should hand it over to you and we can talk a little bit about the amazing announcement that happened last Wednesday.
Yes, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, January 11th, 2023, we launched ZBrush 2023, which now includes access to Redshift. So ZBrush also got a lot of updates, some new tools, some things we were working on as well. We won't be covering those so much today, but we will definitely be creating content for those features as they come out. But just as you can see on Ellie's screen right now, we have Slime Bridge, which is just an awesome tool that lets you connect two objects together quickly with really neat tangly objects. I'm sure that's the best description for that. But it's also cool because it also uses polygroups to help separate. So I see a lot of really neat ways to create connection points, even saliva, slime, alien tentacles, like some crazy stuff happening there. Sculptris Pro got an update as well because like Dynamesh, we have a picker, so you're able to go pick and grab and pick a certain section of your mesh, which will tell you the exact density of that mesh. And then from there, you'll be able to continue sculpting with ease. Sculptris Pro allows you to do that. And what Sculptris Pro does, for anyone who doesn't know, is basically it is changing the density of the mesh on where you paint, not the overall. So you can actually have really low res on one side and really high res on the other, just where you sculpt. So now we've improved not only that you could pick your resolution exactly to match the mesh you're working on, but you can also get smaller triangle sizes. So this is really helpful for fine detail. Then dynamic symmetry, which allows you to basically take your model, which is world center, to ZBrush and work on it symmetrically, then pull it completely away from world center and still keep your model symmetrical, which is a really big deal. I am symmetrical on all axes, X, Y, and Z. And then we have mask region, which is really neat because it lets you to autofill or create custom masking shapes and then fill them with ease. Apply last action is really cool because sometimes ZBrush will have like hundreds of subtools and you want to be able to like fill everything with a color or a material or a certain action. So you can actually go through, do that action in any part of your tool menu. And then if the action was Control Z-able or undoable, then you can actually go through and apply that last action and it will populate to all of your subtools. And then from there, we have a new ZRemesher algorithm called ZRemesher Retry, and also a caching system so that it goes through and it basically looks at your mesh, tries to rebuild it, but then it remembers the current state at which you first ZRemesh. So you can remesh multiple times and try new methods and see if you get something better, but it's always pulling from the first information source, which allows you to get different results. And on top of that, we have a new Keep Polypaint feature, which will be really, really cool, especially for stylized artists, because if you're working with solid colors and you want to keep that color, ZRemesher used to wipe that color out, now it keeps it. And it does a really good job even with gradiency colors, so it's really nice. And then finally, we have Crease Edge with UV Unwrap. So ZBrush doesn't necessarily have a dedicated UV editor built inside of it. However, we do have what's called UV Master, which allows us to auto unwrap quickly our mesh to get something usable to have textures on. Now, what we can do is we can actually crease certain edges exactly where we want that to unwrap, and then unwrap by the creased edge, which allows for more customization of an actual unwrap. And then you can use that on top of UV Master. So a lot of really cool features. I kind of just like glossed over that, but don't worry, we got plenty of content coming, but that's just the overall synopsis. It's really cool, lots of really powerful tools. For 2023, basically the idea was that ZBrush is trying to make your workflow and your experience easier. So all of these tools were developed for ease of use in mind. So hopefully you guys get a chance to play with them. It's really, really neat.
Cool, thanks, Ian. I guess, yeah, I'll send it over to you now and we can talk about one of the big updates that sort of
Redshift. Yes.
Talking about Redshift. Let me just send this over.
Okay, cool. Let me go ahead and pick my monitor too and say
we've actually had a quick question already, which is, do I need to obtain a Redshift license to use the renderer for ZBrush? So do you have to have a license or a sub of Redshift?
So yes, you do. Redshift is a subscription, it's subscription only as far as, so basically what ZBrush ships with is the Redshift bridge. So that you can integrate your Redshift license and subscription into the program. So if you have a subscription to ZBrush, it comes with Redshift CPU version already installed. So you don't have to have a Redshift license for that if you have a sole subscription to ZBrush. But if you have a perpetual 2023 version of ZBrush, then you will need a subscription to activate Redshift. But if you already have Maxon 1, especially if you're a student or a teacher who's using our student teacher licensing, which is only, less than a couple bottles of water every few months, it's really affordable. So definitely check that out. Then you'll have all of Maxon 1, and that means you'll already have Redshift. So that's another way to go about taking a look at it. But to answer your question, yes, you will need a Redshift license of some sort.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Want to make sure.
Yes.
Cool. All right. Are we keeping our faces on camera?
I'm going to switch mine off, and it's totally optional if you would like to leave it on or switch it off.
I'm going to switch mine off just so that people can see just the ZBrush. I'm going to say stop sharing my webcam. Boop, boop, boop. And we're still live. We're still good. I always feel weird.
Good.
All right, cool. So real fast, I'm going to go ahead and hit render. So this is Redshift and ZBrush. Now, this is the first iteration of Redshift and ZBrush. So there are obviously going to be a lot more features and stuff that we want to actually add to this. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a Redshift render. So this is a Redshift bucket render that is inside of ZBrush. And I'm going to just kind of go over just my setup a little bit, and then we're going to build this from scratch. Ideally, right now, what we're looking at is a relatively clay render that's with Redshift. And to know that Redshift is active, if you go under the render menu, which I'm just going to click this little guy one time, which will dock it on the left-hand side. If I come here, we actually have a render folder system called Redshift Render, and inside is Redshift. So this is how you would know Redshift is on or off. If you were to turn this on, and to go back to that question of licensing, if this was off and you try to turn it on, it would actually tell you if your license was activated or not. So if you try to click that and it doesn't work for you, go ahead and check that and make sure that your license is turned on. So this is how we know that Redshift is activated. And real quick too, what I'm going to point to before we go deep into this Redshift menu, because there are a lot of options here. Now, when we were integrating Redshift into ZBrush, the idea was to not disrupt the average user of ZBrush and their workflow. So a lot of stuff that you'll see here, ZBrush artists are already used to this kind of menu system. So if you do have questions, don't be afraid to ask. But one of the things I want to point out too, which is a big proponent of running Redshift, is of course the materials. So right now, ZBrush got a massive update with their materials. So usually there was standard materials and matte cap materials first, but now we have two different types of Redshift materials. We have Redshift Polypaint materials. So this respects the polypaint or the vertex color that is on your actual model. And then we have Redshift preset color materials. So this actually overwrites any color that you would have on your model, so any polypaint, and we give it that kind of preset. So if you're working with a model that has a lot of color that you've customly brought on, then you would want to play with mostly the polypaint material. But if you were just trying to drag and dropping, maybe you had some assets that it just needs to look gold and you don't really care what the color looks like, then we have some different materials that actually comes with the color that would tell you what that is. So there's a lot there. If you wanted to load in your own custom Redshift materials, basically right now what you would do is pick a material you don't really use. Let's say like this hair material, I never use this material. So it's just any standard material or even matte cap material you don't want to use, and just say load. And then what this is going to do is you can go through and you could find a material that you would like, and I have a couple in here. And so I can load in this eye material, and that would go ahead and load up. And that would put it in the proper location, so you weren't chasing around. That's how you've been able to load materials in ZBrush for a while, so this is definitely the way to go about doing it. And as you can see right here, most of my stuff right now has just a basic clay look to it. And so we're going to go ahead and just build this from scratch. I feel like that's the best way to do it. Just kind of wanted to give you an overall idea of what that looks like. So we're going to start from scratch and then go through. And then if you guys have questions towards the end, we're going to go ahead and answer those. But feel free to ask away, because if it's relevant to what I'm talking about, then we can answer it at the moment. So I'm going to pick a live default project, a default project within ZBrush, and start this completely over. So I just have a sphere. And now that was a project I had loaded. So on the tool menu on the top right hand side, I have load tools from project. So I'm actually going to go and I'm going to find that project, which I have right here. And what this will do is actually load just the assets or the tools, the subtools that I was working with, which I will go ahead and release. This will be the project I'll be releasing today. So it will actually take all the assets from the project and load them in, but projects save also your materials, your UIs, it saves everything. So it will load the assets and not load in all your project presets. So you'll be able to start completely from scratch. And here, I'm just gonna go ahead and actually fill this with a basic material. And I'm gonna show that with the new feature, apply last action. So down here on the tool menu at the bottom, I have the Polypaint menu, and I'm going to open this up. Now at the very, very top of ZBrush, there is an mRGB, RGB, and M. M stands for material, RGB for RGB. So I just need to pick the M for material and say Polypaint fill color. And that's going to go ahead and fill that. And if I had multiple subtools, you would see that now this button right here is activated. So I'd be able to click this and say yes, and then any of my visible tools would actually have that Polypaint, that material or Polypaint assigned to that. So then, for example, this would have it. So I'm actually gonna just redo that. This is a cube I have by default. So I'm gonna bring this up here just so you can see that. So I'm gonna come here, just undo that action. Perfect. Then I'm gonna come here back down to my Polypaint, say fill, and then come up to subtool, apply last, and now everything will get that material. So cool, we're gonna hide that. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna build this scene from scratch so that we can kind of see how we start to do a Redshift render. So I'm gonna open up this render menu at the top. Again, I'm gonna click this little icon. You can click and drag this and place this wherever you would want. But in this case, I'm just gonna throw that over there. And now Redshift would by default be turned off. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn that on. Now, if you would like to test your first render in ZBrush is going to be the longest render, because it's going to take all of your geometry and your settings and it's going to send that on over to Redshift. And if you didn't do that for the first render, it needs to send all that geometry, it needs to send all that information. So the very first render in theory will take the longest. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit render. And at the top here on the left-hand side, it's going to say preparing to render. And if any point in time too, if my voice gets crackly because we are rendering, please let me know. I know sometimes Redshift can, or just rendering in general can take resources. But there we go. So that is our first render. Now it doesn't look super impressive because we have a basic material. There's absolutely very little lighting. So this is what we have right now. So we're gonna tackle the lighting. I love doing lighting first. It's like one of the big things, especially before I even get into material editing. So for lighting, we're going to come on up to the very top and we're going to see the menu called light. And I just want to point out too, for anyone here who's new to ZBrush or maybe hasn't recognized it, the menu system at the top is in alphabetical order. So when I come up to light, I'm already thinking that L is a little bit towards the middle of the alphabet. So that's like just kind of, it helps me kind of remember where things are. So with the lighting, same thing. I'm going to dock the lighting on this side because we're not really sculpting. So I'm going to use the menu on the right-hand side. And now I'm going to come into background. And this is where you would actually load an HDR or an EXR. So there's two ways to go about doing that. I can either click this texture menu, come up here to import, and then go find an HDR that I have or an EXR and then load it from there. Or what I could do is open up my light box. So if you have a default UI like me, it's just this button light box, or it's the comma key on the keyboard. And I'm going to go under texture. And then there is a folder called panoramas. It's this first one here. I'm going to double click that. And then this is going to load up a few defaults. The first 3 rows are defaults HDR images, and then the rest are EXR. So I could pick one, like let's pick this guy right here. So I'm going to select it, then I'm going to double click it, and it should auto populate. And you can see it already threw this in. Now, to answer a quick question that might come up, if you don't work in perspective and perspective is turned off, then it will load the color of the HDR, but the lighting information is still there. If you have perspective turned on, you'll actually see the panorama image in the background, and that is so you can actually see the scene a little bit more. And it will default auto rotate with any object. So if you wanted to have your object placed somewhere, like let's say here, that's where I want him to be, standing in the field. So maybe zoom out, then you can go ahead and place him. And you can also control how much of this panorama you see by actually coming up to our draw menu. And here we actually have our different focal lengths. You can have a custom focal length, really go warp speed, throw that out there, or you could start zooming in a lot, or you could pick a default. And as you get a more cropped focal length, then like let's say 85 millimeter, which is perfect for portraits, then you would actually zoom further into that panorama. So if you want to use the panorama, you can control that again under draw and then pick your perspective view. For this one, I'm going to actually work in perspective, but I'm going to stick it at 85 because I think that's good. And now I can start placing my scene where I think it is going to be. And at any point in time, if you wanted to test render to see what you're getting, you Can anybody hear me? My mic just died, sorry.
Yeah, I think we just lost
we
you
can
for
hear
like
you.
2 minutes. I wasn't sure if it was me. I was going to start talking, but yeah, the last 2 minutes.
Okay.
You're back though.
All right, let me repeat that. Sorry, my mic just went bloop, 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 and I was like, okay, that's fine, nice. So going back over just a couple minutes, I'll repeat the perspective. So if your perspective is, well, with loading in HDR, let's start with that one more time. Loading HDR, you can come up to the light box by hitting the comma key or hitting this light box button, and you can go into texture, and then you can go into panoramas, and then you could select an EXR, and then you could double tap that, and then that will auto load that. Or you could come under the light menu, background, and then you can load in a custom HDR. So like I have a few here, and I could say like, oh, I really like this one, and I can load this in. Now the HDR, if you turn perspective off, it just becomes a solid background color. That's because HDRs will work with the perspective the best. So if I turn on perspective by hitting P on the keyboard or hitting this perspective button, now we can see the background. And then if you want to control how much of the background you see, you come up to draw, and the focal length actually controls the background and how much of that you see. So at 24, or I'm sorry, 18 focal length, you actually see a lot more of that studio. 85, it's cropped in a lot. And then if you want to do a test render of any kind, because now you notice too that my object is rotating around with the HDR, we'll turn that off here in a second. If I wanted to do a test render, all I need to do is hover over a spot on my model, press Control or Command if you're on Mac, and R. So that's Control R. I'm going to click that one time, and it's going to go through, and it's just going to analyze that one section of my model, and then it will run through and do like a little bit of a bucket render. And it's just taking a second. But that's how you would control the, or that's how you would load in an HDR. And so there, it just did a test render, and okay, that's working okay. We're gonna obviously change a lot more settings. So now to control and adjust the settings, what I'm gonna do is under the background on the light menu, I actually have a few options. So I have exposure, which will bring up the HDR exposure, either up or down. So that's default at 1. We do have a gamma slider, which is set at 2.2. That's the gamma that we feel was the best representation of any HDR that you download from any other place on the world and bring it in. 2.2 seems to be the default for the right gamma. So we set it to that, but feel free to adjust if you would like to. And then we have a redshift exposure. So the exposure and the redshift exposure works in two different ways. The exposure, like I said, brings up or down the HDR, but the redshift exposure affects the model and how the model sees the light. So if I really wanted a super dark background, but I wanted the model to be bright, I would drop the exposure, but then bring up the redshift exposure. And then again, if I do a test render by hitting Command or Control R over a spot, it's going to do a quick little bucket render, and then it will go ahead and show me my updated results. So now my model's a lot darker, still might be a little hard to see, but it's a lot darker. And so I'd have to play with these two to get something that I really like. By default, everything is set to 1, which is a pretty decent lighting setup. You also have Redshift HDR shadows, so you can control how dark your shadows are. You also have blur, which blurs the actual background. So I can blur that background and get more of a solid color if I wanted. And then longitude and latitude, so I can actually rotate the background independently. And then I can say like, okay, maybe I want something that looks a little bit more like this. And then again, I could just do a little bit of a test render just to see how that is. We don't have a secondary window where you can have Redshift rendering on the side and your viewport. So we are working within our viewport at the moment. So for right now, this is the best way to kind of go through and test your settings. So I'm actually going to throw this over here and then do one more test render, see if I can get some sort of, okay, I'm getting a little bit of a red light. I'll just do that just a little bit more and then do this. So you can come through and start playing and seeing what you want. And I'm also going to turn that exposure down a little bit. Okay, maybe that's too much, but that'll do for now. That'll do for now. Now down here at the bottom, we also have, I'm sorry, I missed the slider. We have tilt. That also allows you to kind of tilt your HDR. That's set at 0 by default. Then we have rotate with object. With this button turned on, it's obviously rotating around with the object, so the HDR stays stationary and glued to that object. But if I uncheck rotate with object, now if I decide to rotate my object in any way, the background itself does not move with me. So now I can rotate my object and try to match it to the lighting. So you can have a little bit more control with how that object is being seen in space to the HDR. And I just hit Shift R to kind of see what an overall look is right now, so we can kind of assess our lighting and move into the next step of lighting. Are there any questions at the moment? I know I go kind of fast, but we are recording this, so we'll be able to come back anytime.
We are, and we don't have any. We did have one earlier when you were talking about 3D printing. Jim was wondering, where do you get your 3D print materials? I know it's slightly off topic, but I thought I'd ask. So
I have, right now, I actually have a Anycubic Photon Mono 4K, awesome machine. I actually just go through Amazon, or I'll check out like the actual store, like Anycubic, and I'll see what resin they have for resin printing. Same thing with PLA. You could just type in, 3D printing PLA 1.75 millimeter, which is the standard if you're doing filaments, or you just type in 3D print resin, and then you can get a quick search. So I usually get it on the web.
Cool, thanks.
Yep. All right. So, and at the end of this, I printed this guy out so I can show you guys the print if anybody wants to see what the print looks like. So, okay. So now that's how you would control HDR. Now, obviously we want to kind of fine tune this a little bit and make this work in our advantage. You can at any point in time when your numbers go red, the way I had them there in a second, so I click there, you can actually type in a value. So if you know that, let's say I really like this at 155, you can just go ahead and do that, and then that can give you kind of a set. So I'm gonna go ahead and stick with this for a second and say that this looks pretty decent for now. We can always adjust. We don't have to set things in stone right away. So that would be the HDR section of that. Now what I want to do is I actually want to go over some of like the render speed qualities and how you can adjust that. So we're going to look on the left-hand side of my UI, and under the Redshift render menu, what we have here is we have a few presets. So we have use default panorama as being the first one that's activated. Like that's right where my eyes go. And what this is a default HDR lighting setup. So if I didn't have any HDR here whatsoever, if I turn this off and I hit render, there was some lighting that was baked in the very beginning. This light information is driven by this button. If I were to turn this off, then we would lose any type of HDR lighting at the moment, and we would want to bring in our own, which we had done. But for the meantime, if you're just like trying to get things set up, this one turned on just gives us a basic light source to work off of. We do also have other lighting that I'm going to go in a little bit more deeper here in a little bit, but for right now, just know that we can combine lighting within ZBrush. So you can bring in HDR, you can use the default panorama, and you can bring in other light sources as well. From here, we have rotate lights with camera. That's turned off by default, but if you really wanted to see like the dark side of the moon or something like that, you really wanted to see, you know, another side of your model, then you would play with this being on or off to see what kind of effects you get during the render. The camera is always set in ZBrush. What you see is your camera. So every time I rotate and move around, my camera is always forward facing for me. So you don't have independent control of your camera through just moving around, but we can set camera presets. So for example, if I wanted to make sure that this was the way I always rendered, I can actually come on up here to draw, and down at the bottom, I can actually store a camera. So I can say store camera and call this my final render and then say enter. And then I can come over here and say, now I'm going to want to see this one, but I want this one to be more zoomed out. So then I come back up to draw down at the bottom and say, let's store another one. And we'll call this the tiny shot. Boom. So now what I can do is actually down at the bottom, I can switch between the two. So I can always know that my model is facing exactly where I want. So when I'm free playing around and moving my model, I don't always have to go and find that. So I could just come back up to draw, and then again, I can hit one of the arrow buttons and then find that exact position. So that's a way you could store your camera so you don't have to worry about that. And then again, you could turn on like, hey, rotate the lights with the camera or off. And then we have a few render quality options. So we have render 5, which is default for bucket rendering. If you turned on ZBrush for the first time and noticed that the progressive rendering button was highlighted first, that's because that's what we have set for default. And that's set at 64. So iterations, that's pretty small, but you can adjust that even smaller. It can go all the way down to 1, which would look not so good. So I find that like I usually set mine to 32 and then I do a test render. And this is how you would switch between progressive rendering and bucket rendering. So from here, I would set it to like 32. But again, since I'm sending the render in its whole, it's going to take a second and then it's going to slowly iterate that render, giving me the overall look. And that doesn't look too bad, but it's a low quality. I can increase that iteration to a higher value to get a much cleaner render, or I can turn on bucket rendering and then adjust the render quality, which 10 being the best and 1 being the worst, or actually 0 being the worst. So 5 is kind of right there in the middle. You also have your primary global illumination engine quality settings. You have a few tabs. You have a primary, which is set to 3, and a secondary, which is set to 2. You could play with these to get different results. But ultimately 3 and 2 is what we found to be one of the best in our opinion, but feel free to play with those. And then preview quality in ZBrush. So you could adjust this so that you can see what actually your render kind of looks like within ZBrush in the preview quality. However, that is going to pull more resources. So we set it pretty low to 3 so that we can get a decent representation of what we're looking at when we're rendering in Redshift. But if you would like to adjust that, you can adjust the quality and the preview size. This won't give you a true representation of what the Redshift render looks like, but you can adjust it and you can get something that looks really good if you want to see it looking good within this area. But that leads me to skipping over depth of field for a second and to our Redshift Baker. What we did was we actually brought in a new Baker system, which will take your render and apply the render to your model and convert it to vertex or polypaint color. So then you can actually look at your model as a whole and see it polypainted, but it looks like a final render. And that's really, really cool. We won't be doing that today, but all you have to do for this is just adjust your longitude, latitude settings, and then that's how many times this is going to rotate and flip, and then it will bake everything. And then you can also preserve any highlights and adjust a color mode. We have 2 types, 1 and 2. 2 being what we, again, thought was the best, so we left it there, but you can adjust these sliders to your content. And then we're going to move back up to the top, which is depth of field. So if I wanted to have a quick depth of field render, I would turn on depth of field. The first focal depth actually has a picker that's brought in, so I can click and drag and drop right there on, let's say, his eye or his face area and say that's where I want the focal length to be. And then the focal radius is how much blur that actually falls off. So if I actually increase this quite a bit, and then I'm going to turn this on, we'll do a full render because hopefully we'll see the result. It's going to go through and kind of do a depth of field. Now I'm on a basic standard material, so we're going to move into materials and adjusting materials, so then you could start actually seeing some of these effects take place. Redshift does respect standard materials and matte cap materials within ZBrush, but your best results, in my opinion, will come from the Redshift materials because you're trying to get a nice realistic render. So that being said, we're going to move into applying a clay material. So we have our material menu here, and I'm going to click and select clay. We have this clay material by default. And then again, I'm going to turn on the M, and then I'm going to come on down to my tool, Polypaint, and fill color. And now we have a clay material. So what we're going to do is now just hit Control R, and I'm going to do this somewhere on his face. And now we're going to see, so we have a different look now. And what this will do is kind of apply our default settings. And now we're going to adjust on how we want. So that might be a little hard to see. So I'm going to zoom in a bit. And I'm going to turn off progressive rendering. And we'll do bucket of 4. And let's try that one more time. And we are using the default panorama HDR. So let's go back in and set in some new lighting, which you can already start to see. And just to showcase that this respects Polypaint, let's actually pick a color that would be a little bit more up the alley of clay. I'm going to say RGB. For this instance, I'm just going to go up to color and fill object, which is the typical way we would fill. And now I'm going to bring in an HDR. So I'm going to go to our light background, texture, import, and I'm going to import this texture here. And then I'm actually going to now pay attention to this on button. If I turn this on button off, it's going to render with the HDR lighting that we brought in, but it won't show the background, and that's okay. So we're going to go ahead and click that because I don't want the background. I want to actually be backgroundless and have a nice, and I can control the background other ways too. I can actually bring in a darker color, or I can bring in a plane with my own custom image. So I can bring in other stuff. And he is super hot and bright white because we have other lighting information. But now you can see the light is coming in and is coming in pretty harsh. If I want to stop this render, just hit escape. That will cancel your render out. And if I click anywhere, it will reset that. So let's actually do some adjustments. So for the first part, before we start adjusting material, up here at the top light, you'll see that we have this lighting information up here. This is default for anyone who's used to ZBrush. This is how we would control light before. You would select the light and then turn it on or off, select another light and then move this dial around. And this would actually indicate where that light source is coming from. And then we can actually take the intensity and turn that down. I'm going to turn this down to 0.001 just so that the light information is not coming through. But what this does is it allows me to see my other materials. Notice how my standard materials now look darker. If I were to turn this off, you would see a lot of the actual thumbnails would go away. That's because light is necessary to drive ZBrush. So I keep this on, I just turn it down to a ridiculously low number, and then this way I can always see my material, but the lighting information is barely, if not at all, affecting it. And now I'm going to kind of adjust that longitude a little bit, and then I'm going to do a test render. Let's lock in this lighting a bit so that you can see what's happening. And that is coming in pretty hot, which is nice. So let's turn this back on. Let's just see what the default one looks like. Let's do a quick sample render. There we go. That's looking really good. Feel free, I know we're doing a tutorial, so I don't want to spend all day just trying to mess with light, but go ahead and feel free to pick the lighting as you desire. From here, now let's adjust our material to get a certain look. So I'm going to go ahead and go up to, so we have render up here at the top. I'm going to go up to material, and I'm going to dock this material off on this side right here. And under material, we have a modifiers button. Now this is, or a modifiers menu, sorry. And what's going to happen is this is where all of our Redshift information is being driven into the material. And this might look daunting at first, but I promise it's not. It's actually grouped in a way that's really simple to kind of follow along with. We, at the very first top menu, we have diffuse color weight and the diffuse roughness. So this is where you would control the diffuse information. And then we move into Metallness, and everything that is under Metallness says reflect. So this will control all of your shiny bits. So anything that you want super reflective or really like, you know, having some sort of shiny information to it, this is what you would do. You would select, you know, you could turn on Metallness, although you don't need Metallness on to have a reflective type of material, but it helps, it really drives it. So you could add a little bit of Metallness if you wanted to, and then of course you can adjust your reflex, so your reflection. So all of that is next to each other because it all kind of works alongside. And then we move into Refract, which of course would be anything that you want to have any type of refraction information coming through, i.e. like glass or ice or crystals. And then you also move into Subsurface Scatter. Now, Subsurface Scatter is turned off by default, but you can turn the amount up a little bit, and then that's going to send that information to Redshift saying now this material is Subsurface Scatter. And this can be controlled by the scale and phase and samples, and whether or not all subtools are affected by other subtools with the Subsurface Scatter. The Subsurface Scatter information is also driven by these two color swatches, the Subsurface Scatter front and the Subsurface Scatter back. If you're used to Redshift and Cinema 4D, you know that you have a color radius that you can control the amount of color and how big that is being sent into your model. This is very similar. You just adjust your front colors and your back colors, and that's the information that's going to drive Subsurface Scatter. So I could turn this, for example, to, let's say, a nice little pink, and then I'm going to turn this one into kind of a deeper red. And I'm going to turn it up for the sake of just really blowing it out so you can see it. And then I'm going to do a sample render here. And you might already see a little bit of reddish tint to him, but if I come through now, you'll see that we're getting kind of a waxy feel. So already we created a little bit of a wax material just by osmosis. So that's how you would control the Subsurface Scatter. If you turn the amount all the way down to 0, again, it will drive 0 Subsurface Scatter. So even if you've dialed in your scale, your phase, and your samples and your color information, once that amount's set to 0, it ignores all Subsurface Scatter information. So you can go ahead and play with those. Then we have a slider for emission. So if you want to have you want to take a subtool and make it a light, then you can just go ahead and turn this on. And you could just turn that sucker on, and now it's going to do a bright white. Note that your object itself will look like a bright white flat color. So I'm going to do a quick sample here, but it is emitting light and other subtools, and the global illumination kicks in and really starts helping seeing things actually cast light. So, and you can control the color of that under the emissive swatch. For now, because obviously he's not glowing that crazy, we're going to turn him off. And then we have coat weight. So this is how you can control all your coat. And then your sheen, so you can control all those reflections as well. We also have coat and sheen swatches, as well as refract and reflect as well. And then we have thin film, and then you have reflect direct indirect settings, so you can adjust those. We have a shadow catcher, which allows any object to be turned into a shadow catcher. So you can make your own shadow catcher materials and have a nice shiny shadow catch, or one that captures very specific information. And then you have a use material color, which this will kind of overwrite. It will take the color that you've set to your base color and overwrite all Polypaint, which is how you can create your own preset Redshift color materials or your Polypaint respective colors. So you could turn this either on or turn this off, and that will say like, okay, that's the color. So I could come through here and say, yeah, I always want this color to be this. Boom. Now it's always going to be that nice orange. Sure, let's actually dial that down. So you could turn that on or you could turn that off. And those are the ways you can do that. Now with that, what we're going to do is we're actually going to go up to our draw size, and we're going to throw in, and we're going to pick our final render shot. So that's a great way to get that information back. I have this nice clay, and now I want to make this clay a little bit shiny. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do a sample render somewhere on his chest. And we're going to go ahead and see what that looks like. And from there, we'll adjust accordingly. how much time do we have? Okay, we got time, perfect. So right now we're getting a little bit of that nice information. And this is what's also I'm going to be leading into next, which is this new feature called Render Recall. Now, I'm going to go ahead and do a test render so you guys can see it. I'm going to blow it up so we can do just a nice sample here on his chest just to see what we got. And now I want this to be a lot more shiny. So what I can do is from here, I'm going to take the reflect roughness. I'm going to dial this way, way, way down. I like to push my materials to extreme values so that I can actually see what the effect is. Sometimes when we're going for subtlety, in my opinion, it's hard to see that right away. So what I do is I really push things looking like really extreme forward or backwards. Like I really push it to one way or the other. And then I try to make sure that like I can see the difference, and then I do a subtle dial then. Now this is a little hard to see. So let's actually change his color one more time to maybe something a little bit lighter, because I really want to see it. That might be too white. Let's go with maybe like a kind of reddish, pinkish, bluish color. There we go. Let's do this. Let's come here and let's do this one more time. And so what I'm going to be able to do is change the color of my object and then change some material settings. So let's say this isn't shiny enough for me and I want to actually do maybe a little bit more metal. So I'm going to bring up some metal. So now my clay now has some metal in it, which fun fact, I actually was researching clay and I guess it does have metal components in it. Who would have thunk? So I'm going to bring in a little bit of metalness, not too much. I'm going to see what that does for me. And that's looking a lot better. Now, I think that's extreme, but how can I tell the difference between one render and another? It's really hard to, and I know I personally like to end up like playing things and trying stuff out, and then I break stuff. Well, under the render menu, right under the main menu that's open, we now have a render recall. And what render recall does is it remembers all of your renders, your materials, and the colors and the filters that you use, and even the lights. Now, how you can basically access this is the slider allows me to come through and start picking up what the render actually looked like. And where this comes in handy, now this might be a little hard to see, so I'm going to try really hard to do this so everyone can see. So I'm going to dock this over here. So right now I messed with the metal at 0.18, and then I messed with the roughness, which is 0.21. If I come to my render recall and I dial it back a couple, and then I say, yeah, this is the setting that I really, really wanted. If we take a look over here, metalness has now been kicked down to 0. Roughness is still at 0.21. So let's actually go back one more. Now roughness is at 0.75. So this remembered all my settings. And like, let's say this was the best setting. This is the one I wanted absolutely to go with. Now all I have to do is hit render again, and I can hit Shift R or Control R to test this render out, and it put all of that information back. Why this is so important is because now you don't have to really sit here and worry about saving out a bunch of materials or constantly saving that project. I could say like, no, I really wanted that setting. So now I can go back in time, re-render that setting out, and it doesn't overwrite all your other samples. It actually tacks on to your next render. So here I can actually still go back and say, you know what? The boss says I really like that metal. So kick it back to that metal list. So I just kick back one and re-render that for him. And I don't have to go through and start messing with materials and trying to reinvent the wheel, because we never quite get it back right where it's supposed to be, right? So here, now I can go back and say, the boss really liked this kind of shiny, chromish, clayish, waxy thing. So I'm gonna go ahead and re-render this out and be like, is this what you wanted? And he's like, yeah, it's ridiculous. I love it. Good job, Ian. Thank you so much. So this is how we can go through and actually play a little bit more freely with our Redshift within ZBrush. And what the other thing too that I would like to point out is while Redshift and ZBrush itself, right now, what's really cool about it is its ability to test render things without having to leave ZBrush. So a lot of us will take our final renders and let's say we'll export out an FBX and we'll try to get everything set up and moved into Cinema 4D and then start building our final scene, getting all that environment and stuff built in. Here, what's neat is that you're really able to use Redshift and ZBrush to kind of get a certain look. You can use it for portfolio, but you can also render high fidelity sculpts. So a lot of us, like this is an optimized mesh, but a lot of us work in ZBrush with millions of polys. And we call them total points because 4 million total points is almost double that in any other program. So this is really working with like 8 million. And so it's like you really got to think about, like, when you're trying to test, render, and get stuff done, this is a really effective way to add to your workflow to start rendering through stuff and just kind of making sure that it's working out the way you intend. And then you can fix your model accordingly and then dial back in and continue the render. So it's really neat to be able to come through and also render high fidelity sculpts. I've rendered as high as 95 million polys, which is huge, and it took a couple minutes. The higher the fidelity, obviously the longer it's going to take to render. However, it is imperative that, like, the fact that you can render that means that you can get test renders out faster and you can really get something that's looking good. The last thing I wanted to cover today, because I know I threw a ton of information out, but again, I'm going to be throwing this project out so you guys can play with it, is the ability to adjust your overall look within Redshift and kind of like fine tune your render a little bit. So one of the things that you can do is, once you have a render that you like, which I can't stand that shininess. So let's go back here. We're going to change that. So we're going to re-render the scene. So I'm going to go back and say, yep, I didn't want that shininess. Here we go, re-render it. What we could do is actually adjust the look and feel of this render itself. So what I can do is I can actually do BPR filters, or I could do an adjustment pass. So under the render menu down at the bottom, we have adjustments. And what's cool is it's off by default, but if I turn this on, I now get contrast, RGB contrast, and so I get contrast, brightness, and gamma control. And so I can actually come through and say, you know what, I want the contrast of this guy to be up a little bit. So I'm going to push that. I do want to push the red contrast a little bit more, but maybe drop down the blue contrast. And then I want to brighten it just a little bit more. But I do want to drop some of that redness brightness, right? Kind of get like this really interesting kind of greenish feel to it. And say, now I like this. Now I can turn this off and turn this back on, and you can see a subtle difference. I can also clear this out if I'm like, I don't like that and I don't remember where I started, just clear that. But this is tacking on top of the Redshift render. So you can turn this off and on anytime you would like. And then you also have what is known as BPR filters. So BPR filters was relied on a lot with our BPR renders in ZBrush before we adopted and integrated Redshift. So now what we can do is, with the BPR filters, let's say I definitely want to add like some noise or blur or even some contrast. I can come into BPR filters, and it might be a little hard to see, so I'm going to zoom in. We have 12 filters, F1 through F12. This is a stacking system. So F1, think of that as the base filter, and then F12, think of that as the very, very top filter. So from here, I could turn on the filter by turning on that little bubble, opening it up, and then I can apply, let's say, a contrast auto gray, and now I can adjust the sliders. I also have blend mode information. So wrong one, blend mode information, where I can say I want this to be an overlay, and I can adjust the overall effect or the opacity of that effect. So you can come through and start doing this. You can also maybe, let's say, add in, let's say I want to add in some material shading. So I can actually click material shading, go to texture, and then I can bring in, let's say, a matte cap gorilla material shading, and then I can actually end up masking that to maybe, let's say, the shadows. So I can just mask this to the shadows and start playing with the radius. That's not a good one. Let's actually do droplet. But you could play with all of these filters in order to really get something that you would like. Negative masking will push it to the background. Forward masking will push it to the subtool itself. So you can adjust all of that. So definitely feel free. There's a lot of play and freedom within these, and you can turn them off or on. You can even reset that filter to its default and then just go ahead and turn that off. So a lot of cool ways to adjust your overall render. And then the last thing I wanted to point out is you can export certain passes with Redshift, and you can also combine certain passes with Redshift. So right now, if I were to go into my BPR render passes, I do a render. Redshift will give us at the moment a shaded, a depth, a mask, and a overall composite look. But here's what's really, really cool is that I can actually combine certain things. So if I wanted to get, let's say, an AO pass or a shadow pass, what I can do is actually come into render, So at the very top, Redshift render engine, I can actually turn off Redshift. I can come back in to open up my render passes for a second. When I turn off Redshift, I'm automatically in a BPR render mode. And here I can get some different work. So you can really start combining these tools to your advantage. And here under render, I can actually adjust the BPR shadow. So maybe I don't want this to be super high. Maybe I want my rays to be, let's say 24 with an angle of 35 as an example, and maybe a G strength of 65 and an F strength of 0.8. So I'm gonna re-render this real quick. So hitting Shift R will still render BPR. And then I really, really, really like how those shadows look, which is really perfect. So now if I come through here and I say, okay, notice I have a shadow pass. If I come into render properties and turn on ambient occlusion and go back to my BPR render pass and say re-render, you'll see that we will end up getting an ambient occlusion pass. And this will be really cool because now I can export these AO passes. So I can say, let's actually save this on my downloads and let's call this, we'll call this Fighter AO. Perfect, that's exported out. And then I'm gonna do the same with the shadow. And then I can switch right back to Redshift, come through here, get my Redshift render, and then I can export those out. And then I can combine those in other avenues as well. So now I can get the Redshift material render come through. And once that's done, I can get the rest of those passes taken out and combine them and composite them for my final look. So that's Redshift overall. I know I threw a lot of information out, but if we do have questions, feel free to ask them and I can go through and answer.
So you read my mind. I was going to ask about passes because Jim was wondering if you could render a .png with no background, so like a transparent alpha image, and looking at those passes, I'd say yes. So
yes.
You can do that and composite, which is pretty cool.
Yes, you can. So you can't render a PNG straight out of Redshift with a background, but we do offer a mask pass. So this will completely chop out your foreground from your background for you. So when I save out this masking pass, I just overlay that, and then that's my quick selection to go ahead and cut the background out the rest of the way. If you're doing like a turn, for example, at the moment, I believe the ZApp link, which a lot of character artists use for turn, works with BPRs and not Redshift at the moment. That is something that we've talked about. So if you do a ZApp link property, if you use to that workflow, you are granted an auto cut from your background. But I would say in this case, for the answer to the question, the best result would be just save out your mask pass and then you can cut it out yourself. It's just a quick select, boop, done.
Cool. So a couple of people are wondering, I know we get this a lot, I think, when we talk about ZBrush, do you work with a mouse or a pen? I know the answer, but I thought it'd be an interesting thing for you to talk about as the ZBrush artist.
Yeah, so right now, because I'm just rendering, I work with a mouse. But when I'm sculpting, I work with a tablet. And just to kind of like re-emphasize this, because I can't emphasize this enough, the tablet doesn't make the artist makes the art. So it doesn't matter what tablet you get. If you do not need a Wacom tablet, you do not need a crazy massive screen when you're starting out, or even as a professional, I work with both. I have multiple tablets. I have Wacom, I have SenseLab, I have Cintiqs, I have tablets. I work really seamlessly with either, and I love the experience. Each one has its pros and its cons. I'm 6'4" with a huge wingspan, so a Cintiq definitely helps when I want to just get like integrated into my work and I want to see nothing but my sculpt in my face. But if you're just starting out and you're trying to do ZBrush, any tablet that has pen pressure sensitivity is going to help you, and there are tons of options out there that are super affordable. So I do recommend using a pen, but you don't have to go crazy with it.
Cool.
Cool.
So there was one other quick question from Jim. He was asking about when talking about the 3D printing, sort of back on that topic, the ZMT file said when the model first opened, it had a 3D print resin file to give the appearance of a printed product. it was a native ZBrush material, but I don't see it in the material tray.
We have a lot of materials that are on our resource page. Let me see if I can find that real fast. But do we have, are there buried materials elsewhere? Let me just make sure. So we do, under the lightbox, we do have some standard materials, and we do have some matte cap materials that I would say weren't widely used, but we wanted to keep them, so we moved them up here. I'm not sure exactly which specific material you might be going through, but let me look at the resource page. I can at least get you a link, and you can go to our resource center, and then you can see if it's there, because we do have a lot of people who have contributed as well. But let's see, matte caps, and can I just put this in the message? Boop. Let me see if everybody sees that. If not, Ellie, I'll just put it in our group chat, and then you can relink that out.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I can see it in the chat, but I know not everyone can see the
Okay,
chat.
cool.
I can link that. That's cool.
Perfect. So I would say check there for sure.
Perfect. Thanks. A few people wondering about the session being recorded. Yes, don't worry, all of these sessions get recorded and they get uploaded onto the Maxon Training Team YouTube channel. So last week's, where we covered Redshift in Blender, is already on there. Just go to YouTube, search Maxon Training Team, and you'll find it under recently uploaded. And then today, if you missed any of this or want to go back, then this will be uploaded within the next 24 hours onto that same YouTube channel.
Absolutely. And two, I'd like to point out that this coming Wednesday at 11 a.m. Los Angeles time, I am also doing this session again, but with also some other additives. We have a feature called Thick Skin, which is really cool, which is a way you can make your sculpts look more clay-like. So I'll be covering more of that as well. So if anyone here is interested in some more of the sculptural approach stuff, that's going to be this Wednesday at 11. So you'll definitely be able to catch us.
Where do they need to go for that?
So that will be on the Maxon Training Team. That will be on ZBrush's YouTube and Twitter. So it'll be cast out to a few places, Facebook and Twitch as well. So it will be on all of those platforms. In fact, here I will provide one more link, and Ellie, this time I'll just send it straight to you. So then,
perfect.
And you can also link to the Maxon one as well. But just our normal social media stuff, where the ZBrush Live usually thrives. And let me go ahead and populate. That's right there.
Yeah,
so lots of places. YouTube is probably one of our best places, but you can also find us on Twitch.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Yes.
Well, that was it's so incredible to see Redshift inside of ZBrush, and like the passes, and like you said, like rendering things out really quickly, and it is really fast, which is like the added benefit of working with Redshift. But it is great to see.
Yeah, I want to share my webcam real quick just so people can see where I got the color from real fast. So hopefully people could see me. But I 3D printed this guy. So for all your 3D printing guys, I 3D printed this over the weekend because I was able to do so. And so the color that you see on the ZBrush screen is a little influenced by the model that was in front of me. This was in 7 pieces. I started gluing some of these pieces together, but yeah, it's really, really cool. And this is, I come from the toy world and aerospace world, so manufacturing has been a big part of my life and my career. So I just love this stuff so much. So if you guys have any 3D printing questions as well, you guys can always reach out. Sculpts as my typical handles as well. So you can always hit me up and see my work there, and you can see, and you can even ask questions. So hit me up, it'll be fun. But yeah, that was the influence, this little guy.
Yeah,
he's got an awesome Discord channel, by the way. The server, if you guys want to check it out, Sculpts.
Yeah, Artists who
Shameless
help
plug-in.
artists. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Artists who help artists. That's where we are. And it doesn't matter if you're a sculptor, if you're an artist, if you paint other platforms, if you happen to put popsicle sticks together and make something amazing. Whatever you do for fun, it's just an awesome community with awesome people.
Is very, very true. But yeah, a lot of people are saying. Also, June was wondering what's the handle. It's IR Sculpts is the handle. And yeah, Jay was saying fantastic session. John was saying it's a quality print, and I agree. It looks amazing. I'm kind of jealous I don't have one.
Oh well, we'll have to fix that anytime.
Alfonso was wondering where's the best place to learn about 3D printing in ZBrush.
3D printing in ZBrush, come to my live streams. Like I said, they're usually every Wednesday. The next 5 weeks are dedicated to Redshift of all kind, but that is the same time slot in which I will also be on. So you can come ask me directly and I can help you with any questions you have. I've demonstrated key cutting and stuff like that before. And then there are some ideas that I have to do 3D printing sessions that we've talked about here. So I do want to put one together and how you can use ZBrush to make your models 3D printable. So that is another session that I have in the works. So make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter so that you can get that information, because I want that to be sooner rather than later for sure.
I'm sure that'll be a popular session. We get asked a lot about 3D printing. So yeah, that would be very, very cool, I'm sure.
Sweet. Well, teaser here. I 3D print.
This is where you find out all the gossip on our live sessions.
Yep.
Well, thanks so much, Ian. That was, as you've seen in the comments, an amazing hour, and it's so great to see. And if anyone does want to know more, then definitely check out Ian's socials. And as he said, the next 5 weeks on his Wednesday sessions are dedicated to all things Redshift in ZBrush. So if you want to know more, it's coming.
Yeah, I'm super excited. Thank you guys. Thank you for having me. I always love these sessions. So there are going to be more. I'm excited. But in the meantime,
it's always a pleasure having you on. And for everyone, next week, we'll be diving into Redshift inside of Houdini with Saul. So definitely join us next Monday. And yeah, we'll see you on a next session soon.
Sweet. Bye, everyone.
Awesome.
Have a great one.
Bye, everyone.